Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture video for week one. I will be going over the lecture content in just a moment. I just wanted to briefly go over on the Blackboard page. So under the start here, there's textbook one and textbook two. Obviously, textbook one is what you're reading from this week. Textbook two is for next week. There was a mistake. I've mentioned that in my announcement, but real quickly on book two, when it comes time for reading, you'll come over here to where it says table of contents, and it'll break it down into which unit. Those are the unit readings that you will do. That's how you access this, is over here on this corner, table of contents, and click on the unit that you are looking for. But so the other thing I want to show real quick is when we look at our week folder, look here, week one. So history of corrections, read chapter 1.1 of text one. Each week, as you see right now, it's not here for you to see, but each reading will be specific in the folder description. So read chapter 1.1 of the text one, and then your work. And so right now, as I'm recording this, the notes are already available, the discussion board, the quiz, all of that is already available. This is the lecture video, which will be coming up, well, when this is done. Anyway, without further ado, let's go over the actual content that I have provided for you. So right away, we have to talk about the history of corrections. If you've taken Intro to Criminal Justice, if you've taken any of the classes before this, some of this is going to be familiar. We do talk about this stuff in Intro to Criminal Justice, but we're going to talk about more specific, and we're going to more in depth here. So anyway, let's start realistically. Obviously, this stuff has been around since the beginning of time. In theory, but what we're looking at is we're going to start in our pre-1800s era. This is the era of common law. If you've taken Intro to Criminal Justice, you know what common law is, or hopefully you do. If not, common law is just the standard of rules that was established according to British rule that, well, they owned the world at the time, so yeah, pretty much everyone followed these things. And so pre-1800s, common law countries relied heavily on physical punishments. There wasn't a whole lot of rehabilitation. A lot of it was just you committed a crime, you get hurt. It's the classic eye for an eye kind of thing. And so that really was the primary mode of quote unquote corrections in the pre 1800s. But if you know anything about history around this time and philosophy and literature, you know that the Enlightenment is happening at this time. And the Enlightenment is all about, higher level thinking and thinking about deeper parts of humanity. And so the high ideas of humanity led to a change at this time for how we viewed punishment. And so we went from physical punishment to the idea that we can reform. And this is where the Reformation movement kind of began in criminal justice. And one of the big early adopters of this, one of the early reformers, is John Howard. He advocated specifically for the use of penitentiaries. And so, real quickly, what a penitentiary is, it's a place where an offender would be penitent. And if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you've heard the word penitent. Penitent is the root of penitentiary, and the idea is that you are humble and reflective. So, a penitentiary, the idea was that by engaging in work and quiet reflection on your own misdeeds, eventually you would be saved through God or whatever deity you believed in. And these were done in solitary cells. So you would not be with a group of people, you'd be by yourself. And so John Howard was very strongly advocating for penitentiaries. And that ended up evolving into our own system. And so the first penitentiary in America, well, one of them is the Philadelphia Walnut Street Jail. Um, it followed the European model that John Howard was big looking at, and all these things. The European model was exactly as I said. You engage in work and reflection in solitary cells, but you do work. The Philadelphia Walnut Street Jail kind of did their own thing eventually. So uh, eventually it evolved into what is known as the Pennsylvania system. But in this system, inmates were kept in solitary confinement in small, dark cells, and no communication was allowed. Uh, this was a 100% silence kind of thing. Early critics at this time kind of looked at the long lasting emotional damage that this plays on individuals, healthy individuals, let alone someone who's incarcerated because they've committed a crime or they are mentally insane, because at this time the mentally insane were placed in jails. So a penitentiary would have people that are not mentally well, and if you were locked in solitary confinement in dark cells, it's not good. So this was not seen as a very productive system, but it was a system that worked. Another one in similar way is the New York system. It developed very much the same way as the Pennsylvania system, where started modeling the European. Eventually, it kind of evolved in its own way. It was established in 1819. Um, Eventually, it did become known as the congregate system, and that's because, well, they are to congregate. Uh, Congregate means to work together, to gather together. So, in particular, in this system, inmates would spend their nights in individual cells, but they were required to congregate in workshops during the day. So, they were supposed to work. But work itself was serious business in this system. And so, inmates were not allowed, they were forbidden from talking while on the job or even at meals. So, that was kind of this big thing. Excuse me. Obviously, if you again know anything about history, there was an emphasis on labor in this one, and it kind of followed the trend of the Industrial Revolution. So, as the Industrial Revolution gained way, and we saw more and more push towards workers in factories and things of that nature, working the line, we get this concept of just doing your job. But it's important to say that not every system followed this. By the mid 19th century, right around the 1850s, the prospects for penitentiaries was grim. There wasn't really any evidence to suggest there was a real impact on rehabilitation or an impact on recidivism rates. Uh, just a reminder for anyone that does not know or has forgotten, recidivism is the rate at which an offender has the likelihood of reoffending. So, anyway, penitentiaries weren't necessarily working. So, we're looking at some other historical ways. And so, in the Deep South, in the Southern system, they had a lease system. And the lease system developed so that businesses would negotiate with the state that they were in or working with to essentially exchange convict labor for inmate care. Uh, these were hard manual labor jobs like logging, cotton picking, and railroad construction. If you've ever seen some old school cartoons or heard of the chain gang, this is where that idea comes from. Where deep south, a southern warden, and you're caught and you're working the chain gang for a railroad or something. This is where this comes from. This is the lease system in practice. Um, so again, not everywhere did it the same. The West is a weird place. So reminder that we're talking mid 1850s. Uh, the West is not established like the East is. It's still very frontiers. So a lot of the frontier prisoners were held in a federal military as a military prisoner. Um, And of course, this is because it was not necessarily like individual states or anything like that. Um, However, with all that, there's the big exception that is California. California did do with the penitentiaries, it followed what the East or the Northeast was doing. But for the most part, the West was very much let the federal government deal with individuals. And so, as I kind of implied and led to this, there was a rising disillusion with penitentiaries, but we also led to this kind of issues of overcrowding and understaffing issues. This really led to a big change, and I'm going to talk about that big change in a second. But one of the notable historical examples of the overcrowding, understaffing, not working prison condition would be New York's Sing Sing prison during this time. It was extremely uh, dirty, unsanitary, unsafe, overcrowded. It was not a good place. So this is like that historical uh, thing to look at for it. I just want to point out how much things change, how much they also stay the same. Our prison system, we are still dealing with overcrowding and understaffing issues. Can't imagine that, you know, we've solved the problem, right? Anyway, um, as this started to happen in 1870, and I'm telling you right now, this is important. This is something that is going to show up on a quiz and will show up on a test. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1870, the National Prison Association, now called the American Correctional Association. But this group of individuals met. They met in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they discussed the issue of overcrowding, understaffing, deplorable prison conditions, how to effectively change the penitentiary system and the systems that were all across. And what they came up with was they came up with a declaration of principles. And the Declaration of Principles boils down to prisons should be operated so that prisoners can be reformed, and reformation should be rewarded with release from confinement. This is what is known as the beginning of the uh, reformatory movement, the reformation of convicts, of individuals who are arrested and in the system. And so, one of the early adopters of this program of reforming was the Elmira Reformatory. So, 1876. So, literally 6 years after they met and put this forward in Elmira, New York, which is not terribly far away from Erie. It's far, but it's not like, you know, 8 hours away. Um, but the Elmira Reformatory was opened in 1876, and it was run by Zebulon Brockway. Yes. And if you're wondering what the heck kind of name is Zebulon, it's actually an old biblical testament name. It's one of the 12 children of Jacob. Just fun random fact for you there. But Zebulon Brockway really took this reformatory idea, and his personal belief was that education was the key to reform. So, yeah, how do we reform prisoners? His idea was education. And the idea was that if they were educated or better educated and they learned from their mistakes and they were able to do higher level critical thinking, they wouldn't commit crimes. And so the idea was that if they could learn, they would no longer need to be there. And so this ended up becoming used as a mark system. And all that means is that you earn marks while you're there. So the mark system was used to track progress towards release. The important thing to note here is that every prisoner, depending on the severity of the crime, the length of the sentence, things of that nature, the total marks you needed to be, quote, reformed varied. They were not the same across the board. They were very much dependent on the individual circumstances. And so that's kind of something that we don't really see, so it's important to emphasize that. But the idea is that as you, if your crime is lower and you earn several positive marks, you would be able to be released sooner from prison than what your initial sentencing might have been. So that's the idea of a mark system. Um, but as I said, we still have a ways to go because we're not even into the 2000s yet. So that model was used for quite a while. But the next big wave and shift we saw was in the 1930s with the rehabilitation model. And the rehabilitation model was due to actually an increased interest and respect for psychology and social sciences. All of a sudden, we were looking at what people studying the mind and the brain were thinking. And a lot of them were saying we need to treat criminal behavior as a disease. And so we follow a medical model. And this means that if it's a disease, it can be cured. And so the rehabilitation model really is just focusing on psychology and treatment rather than punishment. Um, so this was the dominant model, or rather the prominent model, until the 1970s. In the 1970s, there was a rise in crime rates and a new, different prison population, which led to a loss of confidence in a rehabilitation model. And that is right where we go into the crime control model. So it's like the transition. So really, not just was this rising crime rate and the loss of confidence, it made people believe that, quote, nothing works. It's the you can't fix it, so why the heck try? Um, it's the defeatist attitude, but instead of just saying, well, nothing works, they decided to go a little bit further. So, uh, people who supported the crime control model, they very much said, well, rehabilitation was soft on crime, so now we need to be tough on crime. And this looks like longer sentences and more restrictions on individuals. So this is not a happy positive thing within, I guess, corrections as a whole. But we need to talk because this was the dominant model from the 1970s through the mid to late 1990s. And now we are in the 2020s. And that's where things are interesting. And you kind of saw the next slide a little bit, so there is a hint. Um, but after the 1990s and into the 2000s, we, and by we I mean criminal justice scholars and individuals in the field, uh, often describe corrections in general and the court process, the law aspect of criminal justice. We view it as a pendulum. And if you don't know what a pendulum is, think of an old like grandfather clock with a big long thing that ticks back and forth. That's a pendulum. If you've ever seen like those kinetic uh, pendulum balls that smack and go back and forth, those are pendulums. They go from one end to the other. And that's kind of where we are now, historically speaking, for corrections. We are swinging between crime control and rehabilitation. The data that the social scientists and the psychologists put forward show us that rehabilitation can work. It's just not worked the way it was implemented. And crime control doesn't work the way it's implemented. It could potentially work, but we don't know. And so there is this swinging pendulum between the two, and we tend to go between them. Currently, what most experts in this field will say is that there is a push towards community corrections. And the community corrections model is less incarceration in a traditional prison system. We're looking more at rehabilitation centers, early release and parole. We're looking at ways to connect with the community at large, so that the funding is through them. It's not through the state system and taking away from other areas. It's trying to address the overcrowding and the overpopulation. So, like, community corrections is a model that looks to essentially share the load. Everyone is playing a part in corrections. And it's a great idea. We see it is doing fairly good work. It is this kind of, it's rehabilitation, but there's a little bit of that crime control element. So it's kind of like in the middle. So to be aware, it is ever changing. So while we're talking about this right now, in 5 years it could be vastly different. In 10 years, it can be vastly different. It's just one of those. This is a living system, and the nature of a living system is it changes, and that kind of leads to this last piece. Changes in policy correspond with changes in politics. And this is where I say the unfortunate reality of criminal justice as a whole is it is inherently political. Not that you're political if you go into the field, or every person who works in the criminal justice system is highly political. That's not what I mean. The system itself is political because the people who make the decisions, who make the laws, who dictate how things happen, the judges, the sheriffs, these are people who are elected into their position or who are placed by an elected official. The regular officers, the lawyers, these are regular everyday people that do work, do classwork, take tests, get approved, and do the job. But the people that make the real big decisions, the policy choices, these are people that are elected or who are put in positions of power through elected officials. So unfortunately, criminal justice, laws, corrections, all of these things are highly political. And so that's why it's also the pendulum. As we switch between very conservative to very liberal, it's going to change how those things operate. And the other thing is, because it's political and because people are the ones that are making these decisions, individuals, we're not talking the whole community. These are individual people who make these decisions. They follow their personal beliefs. And the other thing they follow is their theory of punishment. And this is what I wanted to kind of wrap up with, is that theory of punishment. In general, there are four main theories of punishment. There's more, but the four main ones are retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, and rehabilitation. If you take an intro to criminal justice, you should know these, but to just go over them, retribution as a theory of punishment is the idea that you are getting revenge. You are getting compensated. You are getting retribution. You're getting something back for what they took. This isn't money. This is eye for an eye stuff. Incapacitation is the theory of punishment that your whole job is to stop them from doing anything else. You are holding them in one place. Deterrence is the idea that you are trying to prevent further action or the action to happen in the first place. And rehabilitation, which we've talked about quite a few times already, is the idea that it can be fixed. It can be, quote, healed. So the big takeaway that I want you hopefully to get from all this is the history of corrections is that it is always changing on the model. We haven't figured out the correct model, I guess you could say, but it's complicated because how do we get to the right place? All right, that's the first lecture video. Welcome to Intro to Corrections. I will talk to you all soon in the next little video update. And yeah, have a good time.